Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I speak today on this Conservative Opposition Day motion, and I want to first of all acknowledge that this is a very serious matter and a motion that is very troubling to speak about. It calls on the House to recognize that a genocide is being carried out by the People's Republic of China against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims, and to call on the government to adopt this position. Madam Speaker, we're in a legislative forum in the House of Commons, but it's also a political forum, and all actions are under that umbrella in this chamber. It would be easy, therefore, to treat this as a political motion, to see it as an attempt by the Conservatives to demonstrate that the government is not strong enough on China or on human rights internationally, and they may well seek to do this in this debate. It's evident that this is part of the challenge to the Liberals, part of their challenge to the Liberals as the governing party. But it's far too serious a matter to treat as a political event. It's a matter of fundamental human rights and the obligations of countries like Canada to call out the actions of states whose actions and practices of widespread and systematic abuses of human rights are of such enormity that they require international opprobrium and action. This is a matter on which we need to work together to seek to bring about an end to these practices and to deter other nations who may follow the lead of China if they are ignored and allowed to be carried on with impunity. It's been said that the term genocide is a loaded word, and therefore we shouldn't use it. The Prime Minister has used that expression himself in this House. And yes, it is a loaded word, loaded with the freight of horrors of the past, a word that was not coined until 1944, to describe the implementation of Nazi policies in occupied Europe and mass killings of the past. Other words were not strong enough. And the actions of the Nazis, the mass murder and executions carried out against the Jews, the Roma, and other peoples, as well as homosexuals, persons with disabilities, mental illness, political enemies, or anyone who did not meet their standards. These horrors have cast a long shadow to this day in the minds and memories of mankind. These atrocities were deserving of a new name, and it came to be called genocide. The term was later incorporated in the United Nations Genocide Convention established in 1948, which was more broadly defined as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And these acts included the killing of members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of that group to another group. So that was the convention definition. They're broad, and any one of them would meet the definition. In Canada, the term cultural genocide has been used by no less an authority than the former Chief Justice of Canada, the Honourable Beverly McLaughlin, in a 2015 speech in reference to the policies and practices of assimilation of Indigenous people adopted by Sir John A. Macdonald's government in the early years of Confederation and continued as part of our cultural history. Colonial history, rather. She called cultural genocide the language of the 21st century, replacing what was then called assimilation. The same phrase, cultural genocide, was used by former Prime Minister Paul Martin a few years before that in reference to the residential school system in testimony before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, saying he needed to call it what it was. Indeed, the report of the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls used the term genocide to describe their findings, a term that was accepted by the Prime Minister. But when we're dealing with the actions of the government of China with respect to the Uyghurs and the Muslims, we must look, and other Turkic Muslims, we must look to the material that was presented to the subcommittee on international human rights that had testimony this summer from many groups and individuals. And they heard from Amnesty International, for example, that China's unrelenting repression of the Uyghur people went back decades, and that other governments, including Canada, failed to make it clear to China that this was unacceptable and had to stop. And they talked about authorities in Xinjiang since 2017 being engaged in a massive campaign of intrusive surveillance, arbitrary detention, torture, political indoctrination, and forced cultural assimilation, targeting the regions, the Uyghurs, the Kazakhs, and other Muslim people. More than 1 million people being held in what they call transformation through education or vocational training centers, but these are actually detention camps. And we've seen in Canada evidence of this and visual evidence of this surveillance and detention camps on our own CBC in 2019. So we have, based on evidence and findings, undeniable evidence of mass internment, arbitrary punishment and torture, and the true scope and nature of which has not yet fully known. So we need to recognize that this mass detention, the forced labor, surveillance, population control measures that have been described by other speakers here today, directed against the Uyghurs and Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang, fits the definition of genocide. If you're dealing with mass detention, population control through various methods such as sterilization and abortion, mass internment and labor camps, these are measures that must be called out by Canada, by this Parliament, and by our government. And we have to recognize that we have an obligation to call out these practices as crimes against humanity and seek international action. Further investigation is required, of course. International action is required by governments and other governments as well. But we need to see that there is no impunity for this type of behavior, that it is called out. Other nations have an interest in what is happening in China for the sake of the future of humanity. If these actions go unnoticed, unnamed, unchecked, unacted upon, we endanger not only the people who are affected by this today in China, but all the people of China who are concerned and fear the continuation and further actions of this nature, not only in China, but in other parts of the world. This cannot be allowed to operate with impunity in the world. Otherwise, we endanger the other nations following suit, following the example of how to treat people who they wish to assimilate, people who they wish to take actions against, that these practices are acceptable and that they will be repeated. We endanger, Mr. Speaker, by not acting, we endanger, in fact, the future of mankind. We see the future of humanity potentially being changed if this kind of action is allowed to continue in China, if it is followed by other nations who feel that they can do the same thing with impunity, and action must be taken. So it is incumbent upon us, Mr. Speaker, to follow and support this motion, because it does, in fact, call out the actions of China for what it is, and acts that are included in the definition of genocide under the Convention Against Genocide, and requiring action to be followed. Hopefully, the government, by adopting this, will also encourage other nations to do the same, continuing to be able to put pressure upon China to change these practices, to end these practices, and make sure that they are not continued either in China or elsewhere. It is something that requires some example by this Parliament, first of all, and the government, to hopefully encourage other nations to follow suit. Those are my comments, Mr. Speaker, and I would welcome any questions or comments from other members of the House.